Want to turn your business into a household name? 9 Ad Manager puts your business in the biggest shows on 9 Now, Australia's most watched free streaming TV platform. Create your campaign, manage when it runs, who it reaches, and track how it performs. You can even create your own video ad, all for only $550. Turn your business into a household name with 9 Ad Manager. To learn more or to get started now, just visit 9admanager.com.au.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Tuesday, October 24. Last week, a High Court ruling sent many state governments into a tailspin. It was Victoria that was wrapped on the knuckles after the court ruled that a tax it imposed on users of electric vehicles was illegal. But this decision could cost the states billions, because this ruling has opened the way for potential changes to all kinds of state taxes, from gaming to car registration. Today, climate and energy correspondent Mike Foley on the political fight that has ensued and the balance between incentivizing the use of electric vehicles in a polluted world with just who's going to pay for our roads. So, Mike, last week, the High Court of Australia handed down a rather significant decision about tax on electric vehicles. So what was that case all about?
The High Court received a challenge from motorists from the community who tested the validity of a state applying an excise tax.
Victoria's road user charge makes EV motorists pay about 2.5 cents for every kilometre travelled and was designed to match the fuel excise paid by petrol-powered drivers.
So that sounds very technical, but basically it means the type of tax on a goods or service, like on fuel, that the Commonwealth typically applies. Victoria had decided to do the same thing, but on individuals driving electric vehicles who obviously don't require any fuel and therefore don't pay any fuel excise tax.
G'day, it's Chris.
An anxious morning for Chris van der Stock. The end of a 2-year battle, a relief.
Nurse manager and father of 4 and a keen, mad electric vehicle guy.
He and fellow plaintiff Kathleen Davies had crowdfunded $52,000 for legal fees to fight the state's EV levy in the High Court.
It just felt like the wrong thing to be doing. We have this issue of our climate emergency where the planet is, getting cooked with CO2 emissions. So to me, the answer is, yes, let's incentivise and do everything we can to get people to electric vehicles. And yeah.
A controversial road user tax on electric vehicles has been sensationally axed by the High Court.
It's first up just a pure relief, can I tell you?
To boil it right down, the High Court found that Victoria doesn't have the constitutional power to charge motorists for the right of using their roads.
And so, Mike, can you tell us about the implications of this decision?
It puts the onus on the federal government, essentially, to recoup the costs from electric vehicles that drivers of petrol cars currently pay. We've got about 49 cents in every litre that you pay for at the Bowser is Commonwealth levied fuel excise. It's a big whack of cash that you're paying every year. Households pay $1,500 or more on average every year at the current price of fuel for their fuel excise tax, and it's very murky how much of that makes its way back into road funding. You know what governments are like with taxes and how they spend it. They have a few tricks up their sleeve, but theoretically fuel excise is paid to maintain roads. And just on the look of it, on the vibe of it, it's not great if EV drivers, who are currently paying on average a lot more for their vehicles than a petrol car driving motorist, they're getting away scot-free, you could argue. There are definitely benefits of having EVs on the road, namely lower emissions, but it's the fairness thing and the perception of governments that are really actively promoting motorists to buy EVs, encouraging them to buy EVs, but at the same time saying to petrol drivers, these guys are getting a free break on the fuel excise that petrol drivers pay.
Okay, and electric vehicles have been a bit of a political issue for a while. Former Prime Minister Scott Morrison once said that EVs would, quote, end the weekend. So why did he say that?
That was a doozy, wasn't it? It quickly became a pretty popular meme online.
It's not going to tow your trailer. It's not going to tow your boat. It's not going to get you out to your favourite camping spot with your family. Bill Shorten wants to end the weekend when it comes to his...
Scott Morrison wanted to polarise the electorate. Bill Shorten, the former Labor leader in the 2019 election, he was promoting ambitious policies to drive EV uptake, and Scott Morrison thought it would be funny and engaging and win a lot of support if he mocked that. It hasn't worked out in the coalition's favour long term with Morrison doing that, because they sort of viewed a bit of an anachronism now, that their approach to EVs, a bit old-fashioned and fuddy-duddy, because EV sales are growing rapidly, and beyond that, the market has moved. Car manufacturers won't give us a choice. There won't be anything but EVs available on the market in decades to come. So it was a political wedge that Morrison tried to drive, and it missed its mark.
Okay, and so this tax that Victoria imposed, it was once described as a handbrake on Australia's already slow uptake of electric vehicles. So is Australia lagging behind other countries? And what are the greatest barriers to more people buying EVs?
The best way to show where Australia's a bit behind the pack of countries like those in the EU, the UK and the US and Japan and even China and India, we don't have a fuel efficiency standard. It's quite a technical thing, but basically a fuel efficiency standard is pollution caps that apply to the entire fleet of cars that any given manufacturer sells into a country. It says to a manufacturer, you've got to have a whole stack of clean cars, of EVs that don't create emissions, to balance out your polluting petrol cars. And usually over time, the clean cars have to start pushing out the old models. Australia doesn't have that yet. We're going to get one, the Albanese government promises, by the start of next year. And then also with our EV targets, we've got some ambitious targets, but not quite as ambitious as other countries. So New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland have set themselves a target to really ramp up sales quite quickly. So by 2030, 50% of all new cars sold will be electric vehicles. We're currently at 8% of all new cars are electric vehicles across the country. It's quite a ramp up when you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars that people are spending. But you look at the US, they're gunning for 67% of all new car sales by 2032. The UK, they're currently 25% of cars sold are EVs, and they're looking to ban petrol motors by 2035, which is also what the EU is doing across its entire jurisdiction. So we are, not quite in step with the scale of ambition of other jurisdictions.
We'll be right back. Okay, and I wanted to step back for a moment, Mike, and ask you about the implications of all of this on global warming. We know Australia wants to achieve net zero emissions in the reduction plan, wants to, of course, address global warming. So how much of a problem is our comparatively slow uptake of electric vehicles in all of this?
10% of our national emissions is down to personal vehicles, Sam. So every chunk of emissions in the national emissions budget counts, however, because you have to reduce in all of those different sectors of the economy to achieve, like you pointed out, that net zero target by 2050. And if we don't move quickly enough on EVs, then we could have 10% or 5% of our national emissions just ticking away without a political solution to it. So it's a big deal, and it's a political hot potato. As you can imagine, it's people's personal budgets. It's how families spend their money on transport. So when you start meddling with a taxpayer's wallet, that can, get people angry at the ballot box.
Okay, and the road tax, this fuel excise levy on drivers, it pours a hell of a lot of money into government coffers to help fund lots of important things. So shouldn't every driver pay? I mean, regardless of whether you're using petrol or electricity? And if this revenue stream is cut, how are we going to pay for our roads?
It's the balancing act, isn't it, Sam? I mean, There's been a lot of legal speculation flowing around from experts that other state taxes that have been imposed for years could be called into question and challenged in the High Court. There's a saying that Paul Keating, I believe, coined, never get between a state premier and a bucket of cash. And that's where Jim Chalmers finds himself, the federal treasurer finds himself right now, where EV drivers are growing as a portion of motorists across the country. Jim Chalmers and his government are helping that to occur, and the premiers are going to be cranky about it because they want all that lovely tax revenue flowing to them.
And so I wanted to return to the court case for a moment. We know there's no ability to appeal this High Court decision, but could the federal government still legislate a tax on EV users?
Sam, yes, in a word. They're looking at that issue right now. The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, who's responsible for the fuel excise tax, he's said that they're grappling with the issue. He's used that word, and the federal government is doing so because of that fairness issue that we touched on before. The federal government is promoting EV sales through scrapping the luxury car tax that's imposed on expensive vehicles. They're, as we said, promised to impose fuel efficiency standards across the whole fleet of car manufacturers sell in Australia. And they're also investing hundreds of millions of dollars in EV charging stations as well. That's to help get Australia's emissions down by encouraging uptake of cars. That's a bit of, taxpayer largesse being redirected to the benefit of EV drivers. It's not a great look if you're saying to the nurse or the fireman whose personal car is a petrol car, they're on a relatively low wage, and all they can afford is a petrol vehicle, and they see people paying $60,000, $80,000 for a Tesla who aren't paying any fuel excise.
And on top of that, the Greens want Labor to rule out a federal tax.
Therein lies the conundrum, because the Greens are very concerned with Australia's emissions reductions and getting greenhouse gases down. So their argument, some might claim it's a bit of a magic pudding solution, or some might claim it's actually quite reasonable. It sort of depends where you sit on the fence. But the Greens say to pay for the lost revenue in fuel excise that will come from EV drivers growing as a portion of the national motorists, just tax polluting companies, tax oil companies, tax gas companies, tax coal miners. That's a pretty difficult pill to swallow for a federal government, especially, who'd be concerned around issues of sovereign risk and investment flight, and all our countries that buy our lovely coal and gas from us might see dwindling supplies as we tax those companies more. So it's a really tricky situation. Like everything in climate change, it's a bind for the federal government. They've got to balance out all the competing interests across here, and the Greens know that, and they're putting pressure on them.
I've got a feeling we're going to be discussing this again. So many of us use cars. So thank you so much, Mike, for joining us.
Thanks, Sam.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Tammy Mills, with technical assistance by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.